everybody. Good evening. My name is Toby Camps. I'm curator of modern and contemporary art here at the Menil Collection. Welcome to the Byzantine Fresco Chapel and a lecture performance by Moya Ford entitled Fabiola. This is a project that was curated by the Belgian artist Alÿs. You're seeing it here on this wall. There are also some cases out in the foyer, and with the curator Lynn Cook. Alÿs is an artist based in Mexico City. He was born in Belgium. He's known for his very broad and fascinating and wild work in a variety of mediums, performances, usually recorded in video. These range from crashing a Russian Lada sedan that he's driven all the way from Antwerp into the tree in the Winter Palace garden in St. Petersburg, to dripping a can of green paint along the green line between Israel and Lebanon, or walking around Mexico City carrying a huge handgun until he was arrested. This project was, first of all, I should thank our sponsors, without whom this wouldn't be possible. This was funded by the John R. Eckel Jr. Foundation, Leslie and Shannon Sasser, and the City of Houston. I'm going to just tell you a little bit about this and then introduce my colleague who will introduce the artist. But this is a project you're seeing here, about 480 plus portraits of the 4th century Roman Saint Fabiola. Fabiola was kind of a precursor to Mother Teresa. She was a noble woman who was married to an abusive husband. She got divorced, she remarried, and when her second husband died, she converted to Christianity and then decided to repent for the sin of divorce. And she used her great fortune to start hospitals for the poor, and she made very public demonstrations of her penance. And Alÿs, when he moved to Mexico City, thought he would hit some of the flea markets in that city and find great reproductions of Rembrandts or Van Goghs or something like that he could decorate his apartment with. Instead, he kept finding these portraits, a red-veiled woman looking, for the most cases, to the left. And it turns out that this is a very beloved subject for amateur painters, and they all are inspired by a lost 1885 original painting of Saint Fabiola by Jean-Jacques Henner, who was a French academic painter. And it's a long, long story. They think maybe that original painting burned up in the San Francisco earthquake fires. But there's a long story about how this saint came to be revived in the 19th century during the resurgence of Catholicism in England, and how she became the patron saint of nurses and abused spouses. But this is kind of a typical project, and it's taken on a life of its own. We are, I think, now the 9th presentation of this exhibition, and happily this has inspired Moya Ford. And I wish I could claim credit for having thought of inviting her, but this belongs to my great colleague in the curatorial department, Cindy Pena, who's going to introduce Lauren and tell you a little bit about what you're about to see. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Toby. Thanks everyone for being here despite the inclement weather. I'm gonna tell a little bit about the space as a way to kind of introduce Lauren and some of the themes that she's thinking about when devising this piece. We are seated within the Byzantine Fresco Chapel, a space built to temporarily house the restored dome and apse of the Church of the Blessed Saint Menil, located outside the village of Alÿs in Cyprus. When Dominique de Menil recovered the fragments from the black market in 1984, she sought the permission of the Orthodox Church of Cyprus to restore the frescoes and exhibit them in Houston until they could be repatriated. This gesture is but one example of how the Menil was founded on a desire to articulate a history that is at once personal and collective. For 15 years, from 1997 when the chapel opened through 2012, the chapel offered a space for people to encounter a piece of history that would have otherwise been lost. After the frescoes returned to their home country in March of 2012, the chapel, now a deconsecrated space, was repurposed to present long-term installations by contemporary artists. The Fabiola project, the second installment in the series, is an apt response to the original intention of the chapel. Since the 1990s, Mexico City-based artist Alÿs has collected depictions of a woman in profile wearing a veil. that he's found in flea markets and antique shops all over the world. The image reproduced is that of a lost 1885 painting by Jean-Jacques Henner. The collection has since grown to include 514 copies, which have been exhibited since 1994 in non-traditional spaces with the help of curator Lynn Cook. From the Hispanic Society of America in New York to the Abbey of Santo Domingo de Silos in Spain. Perhaps, of all the places where the Fabiola project has been shown, the Menil's Byzantine is to date the most fortunate locale. Built as a reliquary box, the space still bears the marks of its previous sacred life, making Alÿs's collection resonate with the history of the frescoes. Whereas the original painting has been lost, the likeness of Henner's Fabiola remains almost intact through the achieved or intended fidelity to the original of the Sunday painters that rigorously copy the prototype. Tonight, we present the first of a series of programs that aim to open a space for recontextualizing and expanding the interpretations of Alÿs's ongoing investigation. These interventions by local artists and scholar will reflect upon the themes and issues that the Fabiola project brings forward. Taking on the sacred aura of the chapel, Moya Ford explores ideas of the original and the copy, inspiration and the divine, faith and authenticity, while also considering the place of woman in religion and art. This lecture performance, titled Fabiola, is divided in 3 parts and questions the devotional and miraculous aspects of art and life through a personal iconographic analysis of religious imagery, art and architecture, and her personal history. Moya Ford is a Texas and Spain-based artist and teacher. She received her MFA from the University of Houston in 2014 and has shown her work at the Lawndale Art Center, Sicardi Gallery, Rice University Media Center, Big Medium, Mexicarta Museum, Fort Worth Contemporary, as well as galleries in Chicago, Japan, and Portugal. This year, she returns to Madrid to teach and continue her writing on artists in the region, a project by which she wishes to introduce English-speaking audiences to artists working in Spain. And that's it. Welcome. And join me in giving a round of applause to Lauren. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming. 1. On a Sunday morning a few months ago, I went to Mondoñedo, a small town in Galicia, Spain. My friend took me there to show me where her family was from. Hundreds of years ago, the village was quite an important site, she said, but it seemed to me that most of the doors on the narrow streets held no people behind them. We entered the town's old cathedral as they were saying the Mass. The space inside was like a dark cavern, and the pews were populated by a handful of bald or white heads. We hovered by the door as my friend, an art historian by training but an English tutor because of the crisis, whispered about the various construction phases of the building. When we exited, I saw a painting hanging on the other side of the door, and the threshold where parishioners enter and exit the church. My friend took a photograph of me as I turned to look at this painting. This is what the photograph looked like. I am facing the corner of a dark wooden entryway. Dull tones pervade the picture because it is raining hard just a few feet away from me. Only the back of my head is visible, and my hair looks impossibly long and uncharacteristically wavy spread across the back of my raincoat. Hanging above me is a painting of the Virgin Mary. Her face gleams the way that metal does when it needs to be polished, and even though her veil and the background are a lurid, glowing red, the painting seems strangely dark. I'm describing this photograph to you instead of showing it because the photo has been lost. The negatives disappeared sometime before I left the country, so now the image exists only in my mind. But when I tell you about the photograph, how it looked, everyone imagines a picture in their minds. If we could somehow capture and show all the pictures everyone just created, maybe they would have something to do with these Fabiolas. The elements are there: a red painting, a woman, something holy, something dark. The eye. I went to Sweden last year before it got cold. One day, while I was alone, something got caught in my eye. I tried to ease it out, but no nudging or tears would get it loose. Over the next few days, my vision started to blur, and I wondered if the thing that was in my eye had scratched it permanently. I worried I'd lose my sight or that my vision would be impaired permanently. The thing that was in my eye made it look like I was on the verge of tears all the time, which was fitting anyway because the man I went to Sweden to be with didn't love me anymore. On my last night there, I told him about my eye. He tried to pry and force and douse it, but nothing would do. I didn't realize the next day when I said a blurry goodbye that it would be the last look I'd ever get of him. I can think about his face as many times as I want, but each time something is different, new, or forgotten. I suppose it is like that with our own faces. We think we know them, and then someone shows us a picture they've taken of us, and our face becomes foreign. My eye was still wet and cloudy when I arrived to Madrid, but I went to the Prado anyway. When I needed a break from the gilded frames and tourists on audio guides, I went to the church behind the museum. No one was inside, so I knelt at a pew. I put my hands together and looked up. My eyes opened wide, magnetized to a body that I'd contemplated so many times before. The man is nude and splayed out across 2 planks of wood. His pale, glossy skin is stretched tight over his bones. He is cut and bleeding in some places, but is mostly milky white. My eyes were fixed on the crucifix like 2 beams between it and I. Tears began to stream down my face. Saint Teresa of Avila wrote this when describing her visions. When I have seen myself drenched with tears, which have flowed painlessly yet so quickly and with such violence that they might have fallen from a cloud in heaven, I realized that it was no dream. And when I left the church, I suddenly realized that my eyes were fine again. Into a cave. The most beautiful church I've ever entered was another one I went to alone. My eyes had to adjust to the church interior, which was dark, and then to the gleaming. An infinity of gold leaf carvings coated every imaginable surface inside. The floor of the church rattled underneath my feet as I stepped on old tombs, and my eyes drifted slowly from one altar's universe to another. Every inch of the walls trapped my eye, and it was a long time before I could move. I was frozen in awe. The only other time this happened to me was when I visited a very large cave. Everywhere around me felt like an infinite void, as if I was descending into a black hole sleeping inside of the earth. I gripped the handrail, fearing that I would stand and look at the endless inside of the cave forever. A woman's face and profile. Many eyes have seen this face. This face has been seen by many eyes. This face has been seen, studied, and shaped. To see something as a painting is to see it differently. To see something in order to paint it is also to see it differently. There's a fragmentation of the subject, a breaking apart of the face into a series of surfaces that catch light. The original image on which all of these Fabiolas is based does not exist anymore. It was lost. There is a chain, an echo, a ripple. By now, it is almost a figment of our imagination. A face that is in profile is not entirely accessible to us. Another cave. Where do I feel most alive? Where do I feel most spiritual? Where do I feel most myself? Where do I transcend to another world? A church? A museum? Painting. I went to a museum and came to tears looking at a painting I'd never seen before. Edvard Munch painted this Starry Night in 1893 when he was my age. The painting is so large that it envelops my body, and I'm caught up in the delicate haze of blue and purple washes. The tiniest dot of neon pink on the horizon cuts into me, unmoors me from place and time. Impossible questions emerge. Is this place real? Had I been there? Would I ever see this landscape or something like it? I thought about how the horizon looked from the rounded rocks of an archipelago I once visited, and about a night years ago when I stood for the first time on the other side of the ocean. Then I thought about how many nights I've slept while stars played above my eyes. Munch's body stood where mine was now, and suddenly we were in communion. His eye or imagination had seen that scene. His arm had moved over that surface. It touched me to think of how important Munch was to Heinz Zemke and to so many other artists, and to remember how close it feels to have a strong influence inside of you for so many years. In the 1930s, Hein wanted to go to Norway to meet Munch, but was blocked by the war, and Munch died in the last year of Nazi occupation. For years after his trip, he painted these landscapes from memory. I sent a postcard of Munch's painting to Teresa, Hein's widow, who continues to keep his memory alive in the 21 years since his death. She wrote me this back. It is mysterious and mystic, uncanny too. It has the power of the universe, the weight and depth of darkness enlightened and scratched by spots of light from stars and from the human eye. It is hope and enchantment, like a melodic line. A woman who showed mercy with the hand. Fabiola was a 4th century Roman woman. She defied the church by remarrying before her first husband was dead. Then there was a break. In the only written account of her life, St. Jerome writes, "She laid bare her wound to all, and Rome beheld with tears the scar upon her livid body. She uncovered her limbs, bared her head, and closed her mouth. She beat the face by which she won her second husband's love. She abhorred all jewelry. She could not even bear to look upon fine linen. She shrank from all adornment." Born a patrician, Fabiola gave all her wealth to the sick and the poor, and they say she founded the West's first hospital. She is the patron saint of difficult marriages, divorced women, victims of physical abuse and unfaithfulness, and widows. Red. Fabiola wears red. Red is how it exists in my mind, but there are more realities. Rojo in Spanish, vermelho in Galician, and vermelho in Portuguese, which I can remember because it looks and sounds like vermilion, a word I learned from paint tubes. Vermilion is made from ground cinnabar. This is the entrance to Almaden, a 2,000-year-old Spanish cinnabar mine that provided the color red to Fabiola and other ancient Romans. Red is the primary ingredient in the Villa of Mysteries, a palace on the outskirts of Pompeii named for its enigmatic frescoes. When the volcano erupted in the year 79, the villa was hidden under meters of ash. That they preserved the frescoes until their excavation 1,830 years later. I sent a friend of mine photographs of the villa walls, and this image of Caravaggio's Bacchus bitten by a lizard. My friend is a painter, and this is his left hand. He makes painstaking paintings from the masterworks of Western art history, pieces by Vermeer, Rubens, Goya, and Delacroix. His paintings aren't copies, and they're not reproductions. I don't know what to call these Fabiolas either. Their Genesis image is lost. So what are they repeating? Perhaps they are studies. The word implies a devotion to detail and an imbibing of material in order to do something else with it. I feel free in choosing whatever image I want, my painter friend said. To me, nothing is untouchable. This act of touching, to touch an image, to explore its reality physically and mentally through painting, also has something to do with the way we hold a holy card. Here is the stairway of the home the painter shares with his partner, who is also an artist. This is her hand. They live next to an old cemetery. I met them on All Saints' Day, when people come to the graveyard from all directions of the city clutching flowers in their hands. And on Revolution Day, everyone there carries a carnation. More carnations here on a monument in a square in Sweden dedicated to the victims of the Spanish Civil War. It was from this square that I marched for labor on May 1st. Red banners flapped and flared towards the sky as thousands of people slowly flowed across the city. Here I am before I met the man I loved, before I knew he existed. And here, after we parted, both times in red. Reflections. To look into the face of your lover is like the sea, which mesmerizes with infinite waves. The mother of the man I loved asked me to draw her son's portrait. It was a face she herself had created and watched change through the years when wrinkles joined his freckles. I remember telling her that you could never look at your loved one's face enough times and be filled. I wanted to look at his face forever, but I tried and could not draw it. His features wouldn't appear. My hands made so many marks that the paper began to tear. The problem was that I didn't want to erode the sanctity of his face, a face that I had studied in his family photo album looking for clues to who he was. To draw him, I had to break his face down into a series of shapes, a geometry, an abstraction. It was reverse transubstantiation. If his face could transform from pores and freckles to a series of flat lines and curves, then it was like something flying away from me, like he himself could disappear. Somewhere else. I never went to church when I lived in Spain. I entered many churches. I sought them out nearly every time I went somewhere new. I thought it would be good to attend Mass, to hear it sung and said in a language buzzing around myself every day, but I never sat for one. Instead, on Sundays, when the city was dead, I went for long walks, looking at empty shop windows lining the crooked streets. Shortly before I left the city, I finally entered a church I had passed many times. Its structure was a frozen page from the experimental phase of Spanish architecture, a time in the 1950s and 60s when administrative buildings and even churches gained futuristic curves and expansive angles. I can only imagine what it was like for folks then, their eyes moving around these giant avant-garde amoebas as they heard the Latin Mass. At some point, I discovered the work of Antonio Taboada Ferradas, a sculptor also known as Willie. I am invited to visit his studio, which has been kept by his devoted sister in the 10 years since his death. Willie lived in the middle of Galicia. To say he is from the heart of the region is apt. Spanish is rarely spoken there, and the pine trees grow thicker and denser than I've ever seen. I left the coast and headed towards the center. The bus windows played like cinema screens. Water poured from granite cliffs along the narrow road as we wound through valleys and tiny villages. The driver stopped randomly, picking up old men and women just to drop them off at another nowhere. Galicia is filled with stout granite crosses, or cruceiros, that are placed at crossroads to guard against specters disguised as humans. I thought of this as I watched these impossibly small old people exit the bus and hobble off into the tightly packed trees. When I finally arrived, I felt suffused with strangeness, as if I had just passed through a fairy tale. I went to Willie's studio and found this photo of him with his hand on the trunk of a cross. Thousands of pilgrims have crossed the Iberian Peninsula for hundreds of years, heading towards the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela, which contains the remains of St. James. The cathedral is the holiest place outside of the Vatican, said a little old man who took me by the elbow and showed me a set of bronze doors. It was granted special privileges like this portal, he said, which is only open in holy years, or 14 times per century. The next holy year was not scheduled to arrive until 2021, he said, but the Pope has intervened and declared 2016 a holy year of mercy. The cathedral was like a breathing animal, panting with pilgrims who had posted up in the pews with their hiking boots and backpacks. I'd never seen anything like it. The atmosphere was festive and convivial, more like a neighborhood market than a Catholic church. I had arrived there after I parted from the one I loved, and the cathedral swallowed me up whole. 2. Initiation. I find a photo of me dressed as Saint Bernadette for a school play. In the legend, a young peasant girl sees visions of Mary near Lourdes, France. The Virgin instructs her to dig in the ground, and the grotto springs forth. My mom keeps bottles of this water when she visited the grotto as a child. I'm asking myself about belief, which is something that I didn't realize has been a quiet but constant urge inside for so long. I remember moments of intensity with faith when I felt called somehow. In those instants, I had the distinct feeling that what was transpiring must have looked just like a holy card. A child's prayer. My conception of prayer began as such. You press your hands together very tightly, aiming upwards. The pressure between your palms and fingers must remain steady. I was taken in by the promiseful information I was given about a shining presence above our heads and the idea that there was a way to be categorically good. I wanted to have something in common with the pretty European-looking ladies on my holy cards who were surrounded by cotton candy clouds and wore colorful robes. These Fabiolas actually looked like those women. Every night, my mom would come and sit on the edge of my bed to hear me say my prayers. I would recite them, hands together, as the hall light shone into my darkened room. I kept my eyes on the light, blinded by this beam from heaven, as I prayed for her. Mass memories. On Ash Wednesday, the priest used his thumb to smear a dark cross across our brow. Other times, he lashed an olive branch at us, flecking us with fat drops of water. And other times, he moved around us, swinging a heavy censer, fumigating us with the smoke of God. The priest is enshrouded with layers of fabric that give the impression of floating as he glides by. His chasuble is embroidered by golden floss that shines in the church light. He is a man forbidden from touch. When we approach him, the priest's fingers draw near to our open waiting mouths, only to recoil, spring-like, before touching flesh. But we receive another. We will touch and wet that body until it dematerializes, washed by saliva and a slow pulsing of the tongue, never biting. It is emphasized that we must never bite the body of Christ, as if he would yelp in pain. The priest has also perfected a way to place the moon-like disc of God's body into our hands without touching us. He lowers the wafer steadily between his thumb and forefinger, as if inserting a coin into a slot. The moment the body of God touches our hands, he pushes it still further, so that it will fall from his fingers full and flat. Then his hand is gone again, flung back toward the mystery of his robes. But on Ash Wednesday, the priest touches us. He must, to slather us with the ashes of last year's palms. And I remember once or twice also being touched with thick, wet oil. Fossils. I attended a church downtown for a couple of years, a modernist building from the 1950s with an odd combination of oak pews, red velvet, and stark lines. During the Mass, I'd examined the church's limestone walls, which were covered in the fossils of aquatic creatures who lived 265 million years ago, a time when the entire state of Texas was submerged underwater. Trilobites, ammonites, brachiopods, and tricites swam here for millions of years before dinosaurs, mammals, fruits, or flowers existed, under different stars and constellations than we know now. The end of that era, called the Permian Age, saw the largest mass extinction in the history of life on Earth. A comment from the article where I got this information. I would think that the author would be dumbfounded to know that all of the creatures fossilized in the limestone were created by just the voice of God. They did not crawl out of a soup of chemicals that just happened to exist and willfully wish themselves into better, more advanced animals, ending with humans. There is order in creation, and there was a plan. He spoke, and there were stars in the heavens, the moon and the sun. God spoke, and the water was filled with living creatures, and the air with birds of all kinds. Then God spoke all living animals, both great and small, onto the land, and finished with the creation of man. Eyes open to the light. During the Second World War, a young nurse named Monique Bourgeois helped Henri Matisse recuperate after cancer surgery in a small village in southern France. Bombs were still falling in the nearby countryside when Monique entered the convent and became Sister Jacques Marie. Monique posed for Matisse before taking the vows. I can imagine her sitting before the Western art god as she contemplates dedicating herself to the Lord. Her gown is open and she leans toward a bowl of apricots, turning the thought over in her mind slowly, like a tongue exploring the inside of its own mouth. Baptized Catholic but no longer religious, Matisse designed the chapel for Monique's order, the Dominican Sisters of Vence. The chapel was Matisse's last major project before his death, and he worked even while he was bedridden. Later, when Sister Jacques Marie told him she believed his labor was inspired by God, Matisse replied, "Yes, but that God is me." Matisse designed these chasubles for the chapel. Esperlucat is a Provençal expression that means the eyes are open to the light. Dominican Father Alain Marie Coutier, who commissioned Matisse's project, said, "I told him that it is not a sad chasuble, but a chasuble of resurrection." He answered, "Death is not the end of everything. It's a door opening." And immediately the artist's eyes were filled with tears. Father Coutier spearheaded other church projects in the 1950s, hiring artists like Braque, Léger, and Chagall to adorn them. While stranded in New York during World War II, he befriended Dominique de Menil as she began collecting art and later helped to inspire the creation of the Rothko Chapel. Dominican. The Dominican order was founded by a Spanish priest in the 13th century. The church I went to growing up was named for the Dominican Saint Catherine of Siena. The first school I went to was Dominican Academy, a small rural elementary run by 2 Dominican nuns. My discovery of art was there. The sisters kept a deck of cards depicting famous paintings from Western art history. Gainsborough's Blue Boy, Renoir's Lady at the Piano, and Rousseau's Desert Sleeper. I examined these images over and over, one after the other. Each card contained another dimension where anything could happen. I couldn't tell if these places and things were real or if they were imaginary inventions, but it didn't matter. Paintings were a beautiful itch that I couldn't quite scratch. Heaven. I was once overwhelmed by the thought of heaven and brought to tears. I was lying on my parents' bed, which was still with the scent of our creation, to die, to be alone. Would others be there? Anything besides the life I knew was terrible. I didn't want to know anything else, to go anywhere else, or even to grow up at all. Lonely, holy. A bell, the sound of my priest's voice as he sang. Later, I found out that it wasn't typical for a priest to sing through such long portions of the Mass. Our priest was from Ireland, and it took me a while to realize that he must be in communion with loneliness. My nuns were also quite old. They must have been in their 70s, and again, it took me a while to realize that they had had other names and had been kids too. Outside of the Mass, our priest wore all black except for a small window of white at his throat. There were whispers of his depression, but his voice, so different to my ears, sounded as beautiful as a bell every Sunday when we sat before him and waited for God between our lips. Innocence. When I was in high school, the sexual abuse plaguing the church was revealed. Things changed. We stopped going to church. I was a virgin. In my innocence and ignorance, I didn't grasp the details of the accusations. I just understood that something extremely dark had poisoned the faith. I was reminded of the second line in the Apostles' Creed, all that is seen and unseen. Maybe the problem was to take another line from the Mass, the mystery of faith. Too much unseen, too much mystery, too much unspoken. Words. In 2008, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops retranslated the official text of the Mass. It It was the first change since the 1960s when it left Latin. More than half of my life has passed since I regularly went to church, but I didn't understand changing something that hinged so much on never changing. The few times afterwards that I went to Mass, I felt like a stack of wooden blocks about to topple over the edge of the pew. I couldn't form the words. I can still go through the old Mass in my head. It stayed in the front of my mind all this time, stored like a relic that pilgrims no longer visit, but can't be discarded. I think of myself as a little girl praying to God. Those words were so different than daily speech. My prayers were more of a reminder to God that I, a small daughter, existed. I prayed because I was alive. 3. Unknowing. I don't know about the Bible. I don't know about dogma. I don't know all the saints or holy places. I don't go to church. I don't even pray at night anymore. Google review of the church I grew up in. I'm an ex-Catholic man, don't ask, but I regularly go to the chapel to do some praying and connect with my relatives who have passed away. My mother's memorial mass a couple of years ago was also at a St. Catherine of Siena church, but out of state, so the local Austin one has a sentimental connection for me. I really like that the chapel is almost always unlocked, so I can go in and pray before working out at Gold's Gym around the corner. It's a beautiful place, and I have a semblance of peace after spending 10 minutes or so to pray and meditate in one of the quiet pews. It means a lot to me, my moments of peace. A woman. The Byzantine chapel was modeled on a reliquary box, a container for something precious. It would be a trespass for a woman to stand before a group of assembled people like this and speak if this space was still sanctified. I can do so because this is a museum. There is something important in forbidden territory, and a thing that is forbidden to even look at. Head covering. Last summer, when my grandmother was still living at her house, I was sent to her room to fetch something, medicine or wipes or her plastic comb. I found a shoebox that, according to the film of dust on its exterior, had not been opened for quite some time. I lifted the lid. Inside was a neatly folded stack of mantillas, lace veils. The mantillas were white, gray, gold, and black. Some were round like floppy plates. Others were longer with scalloped edges like curled sets of eyelashes. Women were compelled to wear these head coverings in churches in the 1950s and 60s when my mother's family lived in Spain. I put one on. Under the gauzy netting of star-like flowers, loops, and whorls, I resembled the saints from my childhood picture books, but with dark eyes instead of pale blue. Flowers. My friend told me about her aunt's near-death experience. She was having my cousin. She was in a labor room, and she just remembered dying. She said it felt like flowers. She said, "It felt like flowers were watching over me. That's the only way I can explain it." When she was waking up, she kept asking the doctor, "Am I here?" And he was like, "Yes." And she was like, "No, but am I really here?" Because she thought she wasn't back on Earth yet. She felt like when she died, she went to wherever it felt like flowers, and she understood what life and Earth were about, that it was a choice, that we all choose to be here from this other place. And no one wanted us to be here. They were like, no, don't go. It's so awful. But we were like, no, we have to. This was in the 1960s when all of this happened, before people started talking about death experiences. She said everyone thought she was crazy, and she didn't want to tell anyone. But she says, "I know there's an afterlife. There is." reality. A painting's reality is the gap between its physical presence, the technique and style, and its imaginary one, the memories and ideas we keep of it. Those associations put us on another plane when we view it. A painting does not have to be a masterpiece or even an original to do this to us. The first painting that I ever knew is a copy of a portion of Diego Velázquez's Feast of Bacchus that's been hanging at my grandmother's house since before I was born. My grandfather was a Mexican-American World War II veteran working in Madrid. He met an artist at a bar and asked him to go to the Prado and paint this painting. He later asked the artist to paint portraits of his children, all 4 of them. The small Velázquez copy hanging over my grandmother's kitchen showed me that painting really existed, but it also showed me that my grandfather, who I never met, cared about painting. Paintings are not just physical objects. They're emotional entities, shape-shifting, charged, and sometimes heavy. And so the first time when I left home and found myself at the Prado Museum, standing in front of Velázquez's Feast of Bacchus, I was overcome by family memories and by my attachment to art itself. A face I love. I was walking with my mother a few weeks ago when suddenly she fell. She eased off the cement and blood came pouring down from her temple, flowing wide and fast across her face. My mom's face was the one I looked at since my eyes were small, round little dimes in a softer version of my skull. Her face shouldn't be covered in blood. I wanted to stop it. I wanted it to stop. And thank God because it did. A letter from my mother to me. I think being raised with faith is very important. Even when you doubt everything, you never give it up. It is such a beautiful gift we are given to believe. I almost drowned when I was 8 years old. It was the summer, and we were traveling to go see my grandparents. We were staying in a motel, and I wanted to go swimming. No one paid attention, and I slipped away. I went to the pool, and I saw people jumping and diving off the board. I wanted to do that too. I went to the board and stood on it, but it was too scary. I decided to sit on the side of the pool instead and just ease in. Before I knew it, I was going further and further down. I realized I was not going to get out. I struggled for a few minutes and then began to pray as I was releasing my breath. I felt so peaceful praying and knowing that it would be okay to die. I really wasn't afraid, and I still remember that feeling to this day. Faith is so powerful, and you don't realize it until you need it. I'm not sure what I would have done without my faith in God. Being a Catholic and attending the Mass helped me through so many traumatic incidents in my life. The special things I still cherish most of all, a rosary and holy water from the 1960s from Lourdes, France. I know they hold healing powers. My family took a trip to Lourdes when I was in elementary school, and I was overwhelmed by the place and what it meant. I love Bernadette so much, I took her name as my confirmation name. There were so many people there getting the water. They were in wheelchairs and some with crutches and all kinds of ailments. I have given some of my precious water to a few people who needed it badly, and they still lived. I no longer attend church. I was very upset about the whole priest scandal, but I worked through it. Priests are just men. Men sin. We are not perfect. But I need my faith, and I thank God that it's been pressed into my soul. I love my statues and my candles and my crosses. I believe in God, and I'm so glad I was raised Catholic. I have found so much peace and comfort in praying. I was blessed with 3 children after being told that it might not be possible for us. Being a mother is my most precious gift from God. The happiness brought by my children has far outweighs the problems I had to face in life. But praying was always there to get me through it all. Prayers to Mary and to the Holy Spirit to fill our souls with strength, patience, and love, to set us free from anxiety and fear so we may face anything that we need to. Cross. There is a massive cement cross standing on a mossy, piney hill over the city where I lived in Spain. It faces the estuary, a wide throat of water edged by rocky beaches and green mountains. These Lacies, once called the Islands of the Gods, are to the west, where the estuary's waters meet the infinite horizon of the Atlantic Ocean. I worked in a small village across the water. I crossed the estuary more than 100 times, but I never spoke to anybody else on the boat. There were times the fog was so thick that it obscured everything around us, but most days were clear enough to see the islands. The passage was magic. Once I looked out the window to see a man in a rowboat pull a giant purple octopus from the water with his bare hands. Another time, I caught a cluster of dorsal fins among the crests of the waves, a special species of dolphin that lives only in that estuary. Mostly, though, I just looked towards the islands, which bordered the estuary like two dark hands resting side by side. Beyond the islands were the Atlantic Ocean, and beyond that was somewhere my family and the people who knew me as Lauren, not Lorena. Thank you. And now I'm taking questions.
And I have a mic here, so
Sorry?
I have a mic here, so
Oh.
just raise your hand. I guess.
Don't be shy. TK.
Sometimes it seems like religion is almost a taboo subject in contemporary art. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it was very taboo before this project. I thought it would be forbidden to speak of belief or faith or institutionalized religion to anyone in this community. I think our community is based on evaluation and critique oftentimes. And so in that way, I thought it would be impossible to really talk what I was doing to others. But what I ended up finding out is that everyone had a lot to say and a lot to share about their memories and their experiences with religion and faith, whether it was something that they had experienced as children or something they were continuing to navigate now. So I want that to be another project, what artists say about faith. I think too, like as artists, we channel something outside of ourselves to create something new. And so there are many more parallels than maybe it seems on the surface. I mean, think about Matisse, what he said, right? So, yes.
A lot of this seemed autobiographical, but were there other inputs you had into producing this work?
Yes. I spent a lot of time looking at the writings of St. Jerome to start, who wrote about Fabiola, but also writings from other saints, St. Catherine of Siena, St. Teresa of Avila, the Bible, even the comments from articles or Google review. I thought it would be important to bring in other voices beyond my own, to talk about how other people relate to faith, to have other voices, because it's such a deep and profound subject. Yeah.
Before about kind of the format of the lecture performance as a thing that more and more contemporary artists are doing, in a way inspired by kind of the pedagogical model of art historical lectures, but also, taken from Joseph Boy's work. So could you talk a little bit about why that format interests you? Because you've done performances like this before where you do an art historical research and also intertwine that with a narrative that is very personal.
Yes. I was a teacher. That's why I first came to Houston. And I've continued to have a teaching practice along with my visual art and writing practices. I think that teachers are very special people that have a lot of power, and that position has a lot of responsibility as well. I think that being for the first time in art history lecture halls is like magic. You're seeing images blown up in the dark, and there are things you've only seen in books, if you're as old as me, before then. And it's a sort of church experience for me. It's spiritual, and like I told Toby, I think that the line is very thin. And here at the Menil also, it's unique in that way. I mean, this space was originally founded with a sort of sanctification, and with the Rothko Chapel as well, and the de Menils were very faithful, and that was part of their mission. So this is a unique space to orchestrate something like that.
Thank you, Lauren.
Yeah.
They're quite reasonably